Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's 1 past the hour, wherever your time zone is. So we'd like to get started on our program this afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the first of our 3-part series on critical conversations on tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte therapies, implementation and adoption for TILS therapy in a cancer program in collaboration with the Oncology Nursing Society. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zahra Mahmoudjafari, and I am the moderator for today's session. I have a couple of reminders before we get started, and then I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists, and we'll get started. So please use the Zoom question and answer to ask any questions, and you can ask these questions throughout the end of the program as well as at the end of the webinar. Hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions because this is a very complicated workflow. You can also utilize the vote function within this section to move questions up in the queue to just kind of give that oomph so that we know that that is a question that many people are interested in. Please do not put any questions for the faculty in the chat. And then this video will be available to view via the ONS webpage and HOPA's YouTube channel in the coming days. None of the planners or faculty for this activity have any relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. Specifically for the Oncology Nursing Society is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. And learners who view the full webinar and complete this online evaluation will earn 1 hour of NCPD contact hours. The link to the evaluation will be provided in the chat at the conclusion of the webinar, and the evaluation will be live for 2 weeks following today's program. Now, today's webinar is being provided jointly by ONS and HOPA, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Kristin Ferguson, Dr. Kirollos, Hanna, and Patricia Chambers. So Kristin serves as a Senior Director of Strategic Operations for Stem Cell Transplant and Cell Therapy at MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, where she oversees the clinical, administrative, quality, and finance staff, if that isn't enough, involved in cellular therapy and bone marrow transplants. Dr. Hanna is currently the Director of Pharmacy at Minnesota Oncology and an Assistant Professor of Pharmacy at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. And Linda Ramsdale is the Assistant Program Director of Immunotherapy Cell Therapy at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I'll hand it now over to our panel and looking forward to a wonderful discussion.
Thanks so much, Zahra. And first and foremost, I just want to welcome our attendees, and we really hope that throughout today's discussion, we can gain an insight on the best opportunities or what institutions should prepare for as they potentially implement and adopt TIL therapies. We do have within the United States 1 FDA-approved TIL therapy at the moment. It's in metastatic melanoma, Lifileucel, which was just approved a few weeks ago or so. But really our goal of today's presentation and part of this series is looking at best practices. We'll look at a later presentation talking about clinical best practices. And then today, just gaining some insights from my colleagues, Kristin and Linda, just about best practices of preparing programs. And during this presentation, hopefully I'll be able to provide some insights as well from community oncology and potentially some challenges that community oncology may see as I do currently practice within a community oncology setting. We do have just some disclosures and the nursing continual professional development credits here on the slide. I'll leave this up just for a few seconds, but again, this is recorded. And these are our learning objectives for today. We're first going to start off by understanding the role of TIL therapy. TIL therapy is tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte therapy in the cancer care realm. We're going to talk about operational best practices for the implementation and adoption of these therapies. And we're also going to talk about the role of the care team in the management of these patients. As Zahra had mentioned, there are multiple operational considerations that we have to think in terms of TIL therapy. Some may think that TIL therapy fall within the realm of CAR T-cell therapy, but what we'll learn is there are some nuances and some key differences between CAR T-cell therapies versus TIL therapy. I know that oncology has faced a lot of really interesting operational challenges over the last several years with bispecifics, CAR T, and now even TIL therapy. So again, hopefully from this presentation, we can highlight some of the best practices for implementation and adoption. I'll give us just a very quick high-level 30,000-foot overview of what TIL therapy is. Really, this, we'll try to highlight what are also the differences between TIL therapy as well as CAR T-cell therapy. But I'm sure many of us are familiar with CAR T-cell therapy. It's been around for quite some time. But when we look at TIL therapy is actually derived from a patient-specific tumor. So anytime a patient is diagnosed with a particular solid malignancy, for example, example, let's say melanoma, for example, we can actually resect a small portion of that tumor. And from that particular tumor, we're able to take tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. So within the lab, that particular sample that was collected, we can take these tumor specific lymphocytes and then allow these lymphocytes to replicate and divide into millions of cells, which we ultimately end up planning to infuse back within the patient. So after these TILs have been expanded within the lab, we have collected these cells. They're usually expanded by what we call interleukin-2, but there's also an aspect of interleukin-2 administration for the patients, which we'll cover in just a little bit. But these patients are oftentimes still going to receive lymphodepleting therapy as well, very similar to a CAR T cell treated patient, with the intent to really wipe out different T cells that may be within circulation. When you look at, for example, the melanoma approved bispecific, the lymphodepleting therapy that is recommended is a flu-cy-based regimen. And then once these patients have received that lymphodepletion, they ultimately receive that TIL therapy reinfusion on the following day, or roughly 24 hours after the last dose of fludarabine. Once these patients receive that infusion of these tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, there oftentimes will then be an administration of IL-2 therapy, depending on where you practice and how long you've been in practice. Infusion of IL-2 is not something that we've really been doing a lot of in any cancers, given that we've seen a lot of updates or a lot of clinical advances where IL-2 maybe has historically played a role, but we do see it making a comeback as it relates to TIL therapy, as it is a protein that does allow for expansion of these cells. We'll go ahead then from here, just kind of kick off our panel discussion. One of the first questions that I do have, I'll kind of throw it out to my colleague, Linda. Linda, I know, as we were planning this and kind of discussing the operations within TIL therapy, that IL-2 infusion component was something that was always, of concern, and what the operations there look like, as well as the safety concerns. Would you mind maybe walking us through that and what your institution's experience has been?
Yes, so if your institution is like my institution, we actually hadn't given any high-dose IL-2 to patients in either many, many, many years, to a point where we didn't even have physicians who remembered giving it here, or um, we only had physician partners who came from other institutes and fellowship who had seen it. So really, we needed to create everything from the ground up, every single nursing workflow. We needed to make sure, because there is that risk of some of the side effects with IL-2, of hypotension, et cetera. And there's a whole other talk in October about side effects. So stay tuned for another lecture there. But we really had to have a mitigation strategy in place to make sure that these patients were going to be safe on the floor, because this is a TIL and it's not a CAR. And because of the high dose IL-2, it was really important and really special with the IL-2 that we had those workflows in place. So not only did we have to make sure we had nursing workflows, it was okay, if a patient did have hypotension, who is the nurse calling? Are they calling the resident, or the APP? How is that getting escalated up the chain of command, and how quickly can we potentially even jump the line to going right to the ICU? So it was a lot of discussions with our nocturnist colleagues, our resident colleagues, the chiefs, and the ICU, to make sure that we had almost as fast track to the ICU if we needed it, amongst all of the other safety mitigation strategies that we had to have in place for a normal cell therapy patient.
Thanks, Linda. Kristin, what about you? And different experiences?
No, I would definitely reiterate what Linda is saying about having a strong inpatient workflow, having strong nursing education surrounding IL-2. At my institution, we just had our first surgery today for the commercial TIL product available. So we're very excited. It was this morning. So we haven't given the product commercially yet in the infusion, but our hospital was a part of the clinical trials of this product. And so our nurses have given IL IL-2. And so we've worked on some of those workflows in the research setting, which, as we all know, is more tightly controlled. But we are, as we get closer and closer to our first commercial infusion, working through those workflows that Linda was talking about. So it's great to hear her experience and know, now that we've had our first surgery and we're, a little over a month away from our first infusion, this is the next step. And I think we're going to be talking through how we kind of organize these steps.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at these therapies, there's going to be a component of institutional preparedness, right? How we prepare our healthcare teams. Linda, I think you mentioned so many different disciplines of the healthcare team that are going to be required to be in place. So this true multidisciplinary approach that's going to be intact. And on top of that, we're also going to have to think of, the finances. Our finance teams are aware of this, surgical services, et cetera. So it'll be really interesting to kind of hear your perspectives around how you prepared your institutions, your healthcare teams, and then we'll even talk about the patient-facing component and how we prepare our patients and their caregivers during administration, prior to administration, and even after administration. So, Kristin, maybe I'll start off with you, given that you guys are just at the forefront of doing this in terms of the FDA approved product right now, but you also, it sounds like, have been part of the clinical trials historically. So you've already had experience. So you have you have the groundwork that you've developed from the clinical trials, and you'll obviously be taking, I'm sure, a lot of those learnings into your commercial patients or your your patients treated with the commercially approved product. Walk me through, the key stakeholders that should be involved as institutions prepare for TIL therapy, and what does this really look like in terms of these various members of the multidisciplinary team?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I think is important before considering pursuing TIL therapy and starting a contract is obviously, like you said, a stakeholder analysis. You're typically going to have a few physician champions who either were involved in the clinical trials or are very up to date and specialized in the treatment of metastatic melanoma. So, of course, institutions that don't have a strong referral base of patients with melanoma may not want to spend a lot of time, resources, planning on onboarding a therapy like this, and would be considering referring patients out for, maybe for receiving this therapy at a larger institution that is able to provide. So you're going to first do, a few meetings with different stakeholders, ensuring that you have a medical oncology champion who has a strong base of melanoma patients. He or she is going to likely connect with the surgery team to see, which surgeons are willing to be a part of this. You really do want to have one or two strong surgical champions who are able to accept patients and be a part of the workflow. A lot of organizations that I'm aware of that have onboarded this therapy already have other commercial cell therapies like CAR T at their institutions. So it makes it a little bit easier for onboarding because they're kind of used to a workflow. They have trained nurses, pharmacists, and staff that are able to support the quick onboarding that could need to happen. But I think we'll consider community aspects throughout the presentation. But you're going to make sure that you have the initial resources in place, and then typically you're going to have an administrator, whether it's an oncology administrator, nurse administrator, be kind of like the owner of the contract. So be the person that is in between the industry partner and then the hospital's legal team, information security, compliance, risk management, and looking at that contract. I know that this product that we're talking about was FDA approved back in February, and a lot of times these contracts start way beyond. I've been thinking about this product for a long time that we're discussing, and it can take many months to get legal teams to agree on just very simple language that happens in a contract. But what's really important for the contract holder is to understand clinically why it's important, how it's going to be beneficial for patients, and kind of compare it to other processes in the hospital to help the legal teams on both sides understand that the hospital can support the onboarding of this product. So after the contract is put in place and after FDA approval, which obviously already happened, then it comes down to continuing to involve stakeholders. So it may have been quite a while since you had those initial meetings, and I think we're going to be talking about workflows in the coming slides. But definitely including all of these people, these roles listed on this slide is really important in considering, doing a stakeholder analysis and considering if you want to onboard this product.
No, it's excellent. Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. So it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, you're going to have some type of, administrative committee to first, doing a financial analysis of this, look at your institutional resources that are available. So maybe something like a P&T committee, clinical practice type of committee. And it sounds like there will be key stakeholders from physicians, surgeons, the finance team, pharmacists, and nurses that are prepared to handle these cellular therapies. And from what I'm hearing is institutions that may have historically done a CAR T cell therapy program, the adoption and implementation here doesn't tend to be maybe as rigorous, other than maybe, what Linda had mentioned about IL-2 administration and some of those nuances there. Linda, from your perspective, what would you say, in terms of key stakeholders, anybody that we may have missed or anybody that should be involved in the process?
So I cannot stress enough, at least at my institution, how integral that our QA department was in the onboarding for these therapies, whether it's CAR or TIL like we're talking about today. They are the backbone of our program. I work very closely with our QA department, and I don't think that we could onboard without them. So just a nice little plug for them, really being incredibly important and making sure that we're in compliance.
Excellent. No, thank you. So Linda, maybe, in terms of the operations, we obviously have, institutions who are interested to adopt TIL therapy. They have to be an authorized treatment center, correct? I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that. What would be kind of the steps that you would say institutions must take or require, or some best practices to become this authorized center? Do we need to ensure certain service lines are in place? And if those service lines are not in place, this is one thing for me as I think through community oncology. Where am I going to get a surgeon that can, help us with this, or how do we handle cellular therapies? And it poses some challenges, as some community oncology may not have a lot of the hospital-based services as large academics or university-based practices. So could you kind of walk me through what an authorized institution might look like?
Sure. So I think first and foremost, having our manufacturing partners and making sure that we undergo all of the education and training from the manufacturing partners to become an authorized treatment center from their perspective. Nothing will happen until that piece is done after the contracting. The other piece that's incredibly important, and we're talking about service lines, is making sure that we have SOPs in place so that every single service line that we are touching has a defined process so that everybody knows exactly how this should go, and whether or not we have to tweak it along the way, that comes with experience. So typically with our manufacturing partners, they will also have their own SOPs so that we will get at least a little bit of guidance of what they're expecting, and then tailor it to our institution and make sure that it's acceptable to our institutional policies and our typical workflows. Thereafter, so once the product is actually FDA approved, that sets off the catalyst. So as long as the contract is all set, that's when we're starting to submit to P&T as that first step, making sure that it's accepted from within the institute. We're thinking about who do we have to educate, whether it's outpatient nursing for lymphodepletion, inpatient nursing for the actual cell administration and the IL-2 administration, thinking about those. All of the APPs that may touch this patient, whether or not it's outpatient APPs before and after, inpatient APPs or residents, depending on your institution, making sure everyone is up to date there and going to all of those conferences, doing all of that education with them. Making sure that our pharmacy partners are plugged in, and at least at my institution, it's our pharmacy partner who is submitting to P&T, circling back, making sure that they know we have consent writers to make sure that we're complying with all of our institutional policies, that we're adding in all of our templated language to make sure that we're covering ourselves from and working with legal on the consent as well, where at least for us, this was a completely novel therapy. And then thinking about when we're looking at order sets, making sure that we have everything in place, not just the cells themselves and having the cell product be able to be administered, but thinking about having an order set for all of the as needed medications for the inpatient team, especially when we're thinking about a novel cell therapy, or at least at my institution, it was novel to use IL-2, and making sure that we really set the APPs or the residents up for success with that panel so that they have everything at their fingertips and know everything that they may need. Additionally, for the outpatient and in my institution, we call them nurse navigators. You could hear nurse coordinators, program nurses, making sure that they have all the tools in their toolkit to be able to take care of these patients. So making sure whether, depending on which electronic medical record you use, we can use templated language, smart phrases, making sure that they're comfortable, that they know how to educate, and that they have the ability to document in the way that they need to and comfortable with the way that they're documenting. And that's just like surface level. Kristin, is there anything else in there that you would add for your institute?
And Kristin, I would really love to, because I heard from both of you talk about contracting, right? And I think many people who aren't familiar with this, they hear contract, it's, oh, I'm going to sign up for a rebate with a pharma partner, right? But obviously here, this is so much more in depth. I'd love to also hear your perspective there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, a lot of times contracts with cell therapy companies are pretty complex. They have multiple contracts within one. So one might be a quality agreement. So Linda's comments about SOP creation and the importance of the QA coordination team are essential. There might be a cell collection agreement. There might be a commercial agreement with payment terms. There's usually a separate partner where the the purchase order is submitted to, and then different hospitals will have different teams submit them. So it could be the pharmacy team, it could be the direct hospital finance team. So a lot of times these contracting discussions are really just going back and forth, and it's a way for the institutional partner to learn about the pharmaceutical partner and understand how the workflow is going to be, as well as doing the onboarding to become an ATC. So those trainings that Linda was talking about, the training that the cell therapy partners, the lab, will be taking on with the preparation of media and understanding, are they going into the OR or not? How is the product reaching the manufacturer in the first place, and then how is it coming back, and what are the addresses, and who is in charge of that? All of those little questions oftentimes are going into the SOP creation and the contracting. And from my point of view, Linda, when I think about institutional best practices, we started weekly meetings pretty early on after the product became commercialized. All of our stakeholders that we talked about in the last slide, they had been aware it was coming, but this, weekly meeting was saying, well, it's here, and now we need to actually kind of talk through workflows. And so these weekly meetings first started with kind of planning, kind of doing, how are we going to create the electronic order sets? How are we going to involve the managed care team? What is the process? And more education for everybody, but also kind of brainstorming meetings. And now they've evolved into our patient review meetings. So discussing patients who have been referred that week, who we've seen in clinic, who is moving forward to surgical consult, who is moving forward to surgery, and who is moving forward to admission. And then where are we at with those steps, and involving all of the key stakeholders. So the hospital finance team, making sure that pre-authorization is obtained. Single case agreements are obtained by our managed care partners. Making sure a nurse coordinator or a nurse navigator, depending on what your institution and calls that title, really, in my institution, that person, it plays the quarterback. So he or she is linking every one of those partners and seamlessly keeping the medical oncologist and the patient involved and understanding at what point their care is in the TIL trajectory.
No, excellent. I mean, that is extremely insightful. So it's not as the contracting piece is not as simple as signing on the line. But it's really great to hear. And this again, as I think of this from institutional preparedness, definitely multiple steps. And I think those who are, it sounds like if they're interested in adoption, it takes several meetings, several weeks of just planning, not just something we can go through P&T, adopt, and move forward with it, right? The next thing I would kind of like to discuss with the two of you, and just really curious to see how you prepared your staff members. So in terms of education and training, what did you feel was required based on the different disciplines of your care teams? How did you roll that out, and what did that look like, or what's your institution currently doing? And what I would also love to hear from both of you is, based on that education, what are your plans for the future? Will there be a certain cadence to a recurring educational component? Is it only for new staff? How do you push that out? And maybe, Kristin, I'll start off that question with you, and then we'll take Linda's insight as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of times institutions, especially my institution, we've already been giving commercial CAR T therapy. And so, I had been connecting with our nurse coordinator who helps oversee our cellular therapies, and she's been aware for a while that the commercial TIL therapy has been coming. So I said, we're going to partner together with a lot of other stakeholders to build this program. And I kind of got her excited in that. And she linked with the company early on to do a lot of education, keep up to date with what's happening, was very excited for the FDA approval, and then has been going to different trainings, webinars, either provided by the company or meetings with our reps, and really being our champion as far as coordination. For other trainings, I think we've been really relying on, the clinical trial piece that we had prior. So understanding how it has been in the past, trying to connect with other organizations and seeing, how they're getting along, connecting with some of our other partners in the community, just understanding kind of where patients want to be referred from, I think is important. A referral pattern was actually something to establish, obviously, quite early on. I think there are only I don't know how many sites are designated as authorized treatment centers, but I know that, I think they're going to be onboarding more, I'm sure, in the coming years. But a lot of our patients right now are coming from far away from DC, so maybe even a couple hours. So establishing a way to, take patients or evaluate them, knowing that they live far away, that they're coming from outside our center, and they're very, very excited for this new commercially available product. We wanted to have a strong nurse navigator, and we call our nurse navigators the people that or onboard our new patients. So it's a little different than maybe some other institutions who we call those coordinators. But our nurse navigator was trained early on into how to have these conversations with patients, calling even patients that might not qualify. So really thinking about each role and being very open to questions as they come up. As I mentioned earlier, our first surgery was today. So last week we had several meetings to retrain, re-prepare for that with the company who came on site 2 days this week for our first surgery. Making sure our cell lab and the OR team are very well connected. So having actually a surgical scheduler champion. We have a woman who, I won't say her name, but she is fabulous, and she doesn't have a mic, but every meeting she's typing up a storm saying, yep, this is this date. Yep, this is how they come to surgery. Yep, I'm going to talk with the patient. So that's kind of a big smattering of information, but it's kind of, touch and go and seeing where people are at, where they feel comfortable, and how it differs from our current processes with CARs, I think is where a lot of questions will come up. And we have a staff who feel very comfortable asking questions and connecting with each other, which is important.
Perfect. And Kristin, before I go to Linda, same question. So you highlighted an institutional champion. Do you have the same institutional champion that covers your CAR T cell therapy service, bispecifics, and TILs, or do they tend to vary between some of these therapeutics?
They vary a little bit. There's a lot of overlap. As an institution, we're trying very strongly to grow our solid tumor cell therapy clinical research. And so we have some medical oncologists that are outside of stem cell transplant and hematology that feel very passionate about growing cell therapy in our institution. So it's interesting. I actually had a conversation this morning with our cell therapy nurse coordinator, team lead, nursing director. And we said we were toying with the idea of, should we start training one standard of care, let's say nurse coordinator in cell therapy, because it's a completely different world at a lot of institutions, including our own. So we have cell therapy nurse coordinators that also do transplant, stem cell transplant, and then we have medical oncology nurse coordinators who do more of the bispecifics at times, but then also the standard chemotherapies. So we're looking at trialing a person who can learn both sides, as we know that in the future, there's going to be more cell therapies approved for solid tumor cancers.
Excellent. Linda, in terms of your staff education and training, how has that looked like?
So from day one of the important pieces that we wanted to make sure we really drove home is that a TIL is not a CAR. And we actually made, for our institution, we made a cheat sheet. These are all of the side effects of CAR. This is what we would expect for TIL, and making sure that we really flush those out, and particularly the differences in symptom management after the cells, because that's where there's a huge variation, particularly with the IL-2. So in order to do that, we actually had a physician partner at a different hospital who routinely gave IL-2. So he came and he gave a very nice lecture to our inpatient APP group, so that we could get a flavor of what does the actual high dose IL-2, if it's a treatment doses for melanoma, what does that actually look like? What do those patients act like? So then we could extrapolate that and say, okay, what do we think these TILS patients are going to look like? As we were onboarding, we actually had several education sessions with our administrative team. So our financial coordinators, our clinical coordinators, and we made sure that everybody knew exactly what the workflows were supposed to be. And we did a dry run before our first patient. So we said, okay, at this time point, what are you going to do? And we mapped it all out so that everybody knew, like, know your role, know exactly what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. And we got really good feedback from the teams that they enjoyed having it all laid out in like a PowerPoint presentation that they could go back and say, what am I supposed to do here? Because it was novel. One of the interesting things, and what Kristin was just talking about, is typically with CAR, we're coming from a heme world. We're not coming from a solid tumor world. So for the nurses that I oversee, we call them nurse navigators at my institution, we actually had to be trained on what is a patient trajectory to get the patient to us. So what is that melanoma patient's journey actually going to look like? So our physician partner, and we have a designated physician partner from every single disease specialty that's underneath our IAC umbrella. So we had that physician partner come to several of our staff meetings and give education to our nurse navigators, saying, okay, this is before they even meet you. This is probably the trajectory of what they're going to go through and what they're going to look like. And this is typical for, what a melanoma patient would look like. So I think that piece of it was really important too. And then, of course, on the back end, after cells, making sure that the nocturnists who might see these or will see these patients overnight, that they knew that this was coming. They got the training on what these patients may look like. The ICU was trained, in addition to our resident services, our chief services, and knowing exactly how these patients should be treated. So it is a novel therapy that we're learning about, and really every aspect of education needed to be attended to here.
And the only thing I think, would add to that too, from a pharmacy, I'll put in a pharmacy plug here, it's going to be important to collaborate with pharmacy, and at least in training and education, with drug shortages, right? So if you need lymphodepleting therapy and there's a drug shortage, it's going to be important to have patient-specific doses. The procurement of IL-2 therapy, that's going to be very important as well, and that's available. And as we navigate through that patient journey that takes, a couple of weeks, from start to finish, things could change drastically during that. And what you don't want to find is that you identified a patient and then you don't have Cytoxan, right? Or whatever the case may be in terms of drug shortages as well. So it's going to be important. Great. So let's talk about identifying patients, right? We have a melanoma approved product currently. I think in the melanoma population, immunotherapy has, changed that landscape drastically. Patients then progress, right? TILs are, they've demonstrated really great response rates, and I know we'll cover that at a different webinar. But as you're identifying patients, any nuances that, are unique that should be looked at in terms of a TIL specific patient? What does that look like? And again, that doesn't have to be melanoma specific, but just maybe the bigger picture. And maybe Linda, I'll start off this one with you.
Thank you. So when we're thinking about a TIL patient, we really want to make sure that medically they're well enough to receive the treatment, particularly, and I think I keep harping on this, the IL-2. We need to make sure that they have the reserve to be able to withstand whatever side effects they may incur from the IL-2, where primarily the symptoms that they're going to experience are from that. In addition to that, we at my institute, we have our own internal eligibility checklist. So it's designed by our IEC program and me, as well as our melanoma team lead, collaboratively together to make sure that within our program as a whole, this is what we want to use for our markers, and in addition to what the melanoma team would want as well. So really making sure that we have a really defined outline of what do we want these patients to look like before they receive treatment? What do we think that is important? So things like PFTs, IDMs, those are going to be standard, but there may be other nuances of like, what do we want their creatinine clearance, their GFR to be? What are we willing to tolerate, and what do we think is acceptable for the patients and safe?
Thank you, Lena. No, that's excellent. And just for the sake of time, Kristin, maybe I'll pivot a little bit with you and talk a little bit about supportive care needs. What does that look like in terms of our patients? And I love something that Linda said. Majority of the adverse events we see are probably due to IL-2 therapy or the lymphodepleting therapy, right? It's not really the TIL administration. In terms of your institution, do you have protocols in place that dictate, specific supportive care measures? And, what does that look like? Do you have various specialists that may be consulted to see these patients and support them through? What does that kind of look like?
Absolutely, yes. We have onboarded one of our social workers, our melanoma social worker, on how to do psychosocial clearance for a cell therapy product. So kind of the same process that we do for our CARs, but a different social worker. So he's been attending our weekly meetings to discuss patients. All patients are referred to him if we believe they're going to be moving forward. So he's part of kind of our clearance process. We have a financial counselor who is involved from the very beginning, and I know a lot of institutions might have questions on financial clearance protocols. Basically, if we feel a patient is appropriate clinically to move forward, we start having a dual workflow where the patient will start having their clearance tests like the ones Linda mentioned, PFTs, echo, maybe a stress test, some labs, IDMs, and then our financial counselor is submitting the case for pre-certification. It's been a little bit challenging in the beginning, as all new therapies are, because insurances and payers are a little bit slower to update their guidelines. So the financial counselor and the managed care team have been spending a lot of time looking into these, trying to see what J code to use, trying to see if payers are updating their guidelines. And usually our industry partner can be helpful sometimes in helping make us aware of any changes. But it can be a real touch and go for a while, and kind of take up to a month. We have to let patients know. Simultaneously, we are scheduling patients with a surgeon for a surgical consult. So it's very important to make sure that the tumor that they select is operable, because obviously if it is not, the patient cannot move forward. So we usually don't wait until financial clearance is complete before they have the surgical consult, should we need to abort the plan and change the treatment plan for the patient.
That's great insight. No, thank you. And I think that might be something that some of us were not aware of. So it's very, very important to highlight. So in terms of, the financial consult, Linda, I'll throw it back to you with this one. What does reimbursement look like here? What are some best practices as you guys have navigated ensuring financial clearance for this, that you're going to be reimbursed for this? Obviously, these are going to be expensive services, collaborating with multiple disciplines. What does that look like in terms of a best practice as well?
So at our institution, we have a little bit of a unique setup where we are an outpatient facility, and we have a separate hospital that we actually admit to for inpatient services. So it might be our experience might be a little bit different than the average institute. What I can say is that our financial counselors, as soon as we know about a patient, our financial counselors are looped in to have a discussion with the patient. And one of the things that we have seen frequently, unfortunately, is a patient who changes insurance for whatever reason it may be, partway through their workup, thus changing who we're going to be asking for the financial clearance. So that can be a sticking point, and that can actually delay things. And then also to just put a little plug in that with anytime there's a new therapy, there's always going to be a lag with any of our partners. So just making sure that for those first few patients, as you're onboarding them, letting them know, and maybe several weeks before we get this financial clearance. And at times, as Kristin had mentioned too, sometimes we have to ask our industry partners to help us, especially if they have contacts.
Oh, thank you, Linda. I think that's extremely insightful. Before we pivot and talk a little bit about the patient and caregiver preparedness. Obviously we've seen, the TIL journey thus far. We have a commercially approved product. Both of you have been involved with some of the clinical trial involvement. What are some, after we've discussed all of this and maybe just kind of like a quick summary, or not so summary, but things we may have missed, what are some, important lessons that I've learned that institutions should adopt? I think one thing that we didn't really mention is also, given these multiple care teams, I would be interested to hear about what are the best communication strategies that you ensure are between medical oncology, the surgeon, the financial navigators, pharmacy services. What does that look like in terms of best practices? So if you want to talk about a little communication and just sort of any final remarks about institutional preparedness before we move to the patient. And Kristin, I'll turn it to you.
Sure. So I think having kind of a standard use of the EMR, at my institution, we have Cerner. So we use the message center and communicate through the patient's chart, looping in, who needs to be aware of certain things. Maybe we wouldn't loop in the financial counselor in every single, message if it's all clinically focused. But if we're waiting on a prior auth and we need to let the surgical team know, hey, it's great that the patient has an operable tumor, but we need to wait until we schedule the surgery. So we make sure the patient doesn't endure any undue cost. Hold on that scheduling or schedule it far in advance so that our financial counselor can work on that. But we, use the EMR for communication, and then our weekly meetings are a really good touch point for all teams to come together, confirm dates, and ensuring that, it's all matching up and lining up with the dates available from the company. So I think that's another challenge that nurse navigators and nurse coordinators are looking at, making sure that the OR date is available, that the company date is available for manufacturing, and then also, of course, informing in our institution our cell therapy lab partners, because in our institution, the lab will go to the OR, get the specimen, and then be the ones that the company sends a courier to pick up. So all of that coordination is really important to discuss very closely, plan ahead, a month in advance if possible. And of course, always updating the patient on where things are at, as well as their community referring provider. So if they need therapy in between, surgery and then infusion of the product, that is another thing to discuss. Always checking in how the patient is doing and keeping them and their referring community oncologist aware of that.
Appreciate you calling that out, and we'll definitely get more into that. Linda, maybe for you, just final remarks of, lessons learned or in terms of institutional preparedness, anything that we may have missed or you think should be a top priority?
I think top priority is just ensuring that both the administrative side and the clinical side are plugged into each other, and making sure that we're working, working closely together to make sure that we're aligned with the same goals.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So let's shift a little bit, spend a few minutes talking about preparing our patients and their caregivers, and then we'll certainly open it up to some questions. I'm seeing some come through the Q&A. So again, just a reminder for our attendees, please don't hesitate to submit those through the Q&A. So Linda, I'll throw this one out to you. In terms as you're preparing your patients and their caregivers, what have you had to develop out as it relates to TIL therapy? And again, were there similarities from your prior experience with CAR-T or bispecifics, or was it completely a brand new rollout and expectations for patients?
So we were lucky having the experience with CAR, where we were able to leverage a lot of the workflows that our nurses are using with a TILS twist. So we always call the patient once the patient is identified as a potential candidate going to move forward. The nurse does an initial phone call, gives a high-level overview of what TILS is, talks to the patient, say, do you want to move forward? And then that sets off the catalyst to have all of the other appointments made. We always meet the patient, have a dedicated teach set. When I say we, I mean the nurses, have a dedicated teach session with the patient on the day of consenting. And then that is actually followed by our clinical pharmacist, who will meet with the patient as well, do a thorough review of all of the medications that they're on currently, their allergies, see do we need to plug them into allergy as well. And the patient leaves with a guidebook that we give them. So it's all of the information that we're talking about in a nice linear format. So they have a total high-level overview of what TILS actually is. I think that we've learned patients are going to remember just a fraction of what we say. So having both education that is verbal and having education that is written and something for them to refer to is absolutely paramount in this, especially with such a complex therapy.
No, thank you. I think that's very important. So Kristin, maybe in terms of that patient education and also preparedness, have you know, what type of supportive cares does the patient get educated on as they're kind of leaving our institutions, and what does that look like?
So prior to even having surgery or being admitted for TIL therapy, we have actually created a slide deck where we will go over information with patients on what to expect prior to surgery, prior to admission, during their admission stay, what IL-2 is, what side effects they may experience, and then what they should know when they're going home. This is part of our patient and caregiver education, and why we want to make sure that patients are going home with somebody that they trust and that can help them in the at least 2 weeks after they're discharged. So what we do is we ensure that we've connected with someone that they've identified as a caregiver, whether it be a family member that they're living with, a close friend, somebody that's traveling from a distance to stay with them for a few weeks after their discharge. But we have this conversation with them very early on, and then we thread that education continually throughout their stay, through their admission. Our inpatient team then reiterates the same education prior to discharge. And we like to see our patients. We haven't had a TILS patient admission yet, but we would plan to see them within, 2 to 3 days post discharge. So we keep a very close eye on our patients, provide them with that printed education. We're planning on actually recording verbally a session for them so that they can re-review education that we've been giving to them, watch it live if they're more of an audio learner versus someone that likes to read, so that they have it in different forms, and then we continually go over it with them.
And I love that idea. I've seen multiple practices, and even we've done something similar where we've recorded videos around certain topics, and they're either available through a handout you give to a patient with a QR code, or just even readily available on the institution's homepage, where they navigate through patient education. Some have put it out on YouTube. I know I've seen things come from Sloan Kettering, some from community, just really from all over around that general education. I can't stress the importance of that, just as a tool patients can reference after the fact, because they're already just bombarded with tons of information. And Linda, I think you had mentioned it. I love the written and the verbal component. So you're really exhausting, the multiple modalities of way people can take that information. And I think that's extremely important. Talk to me a little bit about the care coordination, right? And Kristin, this is why I said we'll come back to that, right? Some of these patients may be treated in the community setting, right? And while I think that the utilization of TIL therapy is going to be extremely limited due to some of the operational things we've talked about today within community oncology, they will get referred to maybe a large academic or an institution doing TIL therapy. What are we discussing with our patients in terms of that care coordination? How long does this whole process take? They get referred to you. You're working them up. They're going to need surgery. We're going to need, cellular expansion, lymphodepleting therapy, IL-2. What does that duration and that coordination of care look like? And Kristin, since you brought it up, I'll throw that question right back to you.
Yeah, it can vary, on the financial piece, and how quickly we're able to get the prior authorization, the single case agreement, how ready the patient is, if they're ready at the time that we see them for that initial consult, or do they need more therapy before being considered based on, FDA guidelines. But it is definitely something we do, give a full FTE to. We have the same nurse coordinator coordinating CARs as we do TILs, so that she's kind of in that mode of working with our industry partners, working with the cell lab, working with the inpatient cell therapy nurses, and several physicians that are prescribing these products. But the piece is that person has to be incredibly dedicated to kind of checking in daily with the progress of that patient and moving them forward, and then seeing are they ready to be scheduled for surgery, are they waiting for something, are there any barriers. Really, is identifying barriers is one of the key parts of their role, while continually educating the patient, and ensuring that they have that caregiver piece down and they feel comfortable moving forward.
Excellent, excellent. Linda, we'll wrap it up with you, and we'll go to, our Q&A session. Financial planning for these patients, obviously. So there's going to be multiple aspects of that, and what should we be counseling and educating our patients on in terms of the financial planning of receiving these therapies?
When we're talking about financial planning, I think that we need to let our patients know that this process can take several weeks depending on what the insurance is. So it's not going, it typically, I should say, isn't same day or next day. And I would say that usually it's several weeks before we're able to actually get the financial clearance. When we're talking about timelines for these patients, when we think about the financial clearance ballparking around a month, we're also trying to coordinate at the same time the surgical schedule of that surgeon, in addition to the manufacturing schedule and what is available through the manufacturer for the actual manufacturing of the TIL. So sometimes it can be 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks before that patient's actually able to get that surgery. And then they are also going to have to wait until that product is fully manufactured. So we're thinking about, could be 2-3 months before this patient, worst case scenario, seeing that product come back. And then, of course, there's always the risk of the patient having a product that's out of specification, which could delay things further. So these aren't quick treatments. It's not something that we're going to admit, and then next day or next week even be able to potentially do. So really setting those expectations up front. Within that process, as I mentioned before, educating our patients that if you can prevent having an insurance change in the middle of it, it is really important, because if there's an insurance change, it's going to just push that timeline back. And then when we're talking to patients, we also need to let them know peripherally there could be other costs that are incurred. So if they have to stay locally, if they are coming from a community partner far away, thinking about hotel costs, how can we offset that? Having patients, if they're here in a hotel, they're going to have to buy food, or they're going to be eating out more often, and all those other little expenses, parking, travel, those type of things that can really add up for a patient.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think this was extremely insightful from you both. Zahra, I will turn it over to you to walk us through some of the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. I'm kind of glad that my camera wasn't necessarily showing during the panel, because I felt like a little bit of a bobblehead as I identify with so much of what both Linda and Kristin have said in terms of being prepared. I did try to take some notes as well. You guys have been answering questions for the duration of the last hour, but some of the key things that I kind of took home and wanted to make sure that we circled back on is, this is a hint to the audience. If you have questions, to go ahead and put questions in the chat. Kirollos actually did a good job of covering a couple of them during the discussion as well. But I think the key word I heard, if we had $1 for every time you both said coordination, I think we'd be sitting pretty solid in terms of making sure that every stakeholder was informed and prepared for the differences related to TILs as opposed to CAR-T, because there are a lot of differences. And I would venture to say it's far more complicated than CAR-T is. So really kudos for bringing that out and identifying the fact that you do need early meetings and often meetings. And then I think, Linda, it might have been you that identified how important it is to be, and probably Kristin as well, how important it is to be agile and to take your flow that you've designed and redesign it every single time you have a patient. And so I know we certainly have done that here at KU. In fact, we had 2 or 3 meetings in the last couple of weeks, and we've been a live center for a while now. So you both touched on the SOPs and making sure that those are well oiled machines, whether those be PowerPoint presentations. In my case, I made some really great videos that help kind of depict the entire process from start to finish. So really appreciate that you all touched on the payer challenges that we have here. So as well as the educational needs from our patients and the caregivers or care providers that they also will benefit greatly from understanding this new therapy. So those were just a few of the notes that I took, and we've got about 7 minutes. So I wanted to go through some of the questions that came through the Q&A. Any experience with large health systems with multiple hospitals? Are you handling multiple infusion sites and hospitals at your institutions?
My site is a multi-hospital group, and only one of our sites, my site, is doing actually TIL infusion. So we are accepting referrals from within our hospital system, as well as our external community providers.
Great. Thanks, Kristin. Ours is the same way. We're in essence having all of our patients throughout our network come through one site at this point, because it's just a little too complicated to spread out amongst everyone. I think you might have touched on this a little bit, but the process for financial clearance for the treatment, are you clearing as a bundle or with each individual piece?
We are doing a bundle right now. I think it's something we keep reassessing. Linda, I'd be interested in hearing your experience.
So we also try to do a bundle, but I think it depends on the payer of how they're willing to approve it. So some of it's not up to us, unfortunately.
Yeah, same. Ours is also a bundle. And I think the one caveat that came from this is the reimbursement for the surgical procedure, because that is something that's somewhat unique. And so that is something that we continue to evaluate and work on, but that has certainly come up at my organization as well. The next question is, when do your patients transition back to the melanoma team? How is that defined at each of your organizations? And Linda, I guess we can start with you.
So at our organization, our melanoma lead continues with that patient throughout the entire therapy, but the difference is our nursing groups will change. So once we get a name and we start working on that patient, our nurses flip to the IEC ONNs, and then we're going to follow those patients throughout the entire course of their therapy through their first scan. After that first scan, that's when the nursing groups will hand back off to the normal disease center, but the physician will remain the same through the entire treatment.
That is
Great.
exactly what we do at my institution as well. And I know I have heard from other institutions doing the, actually passing the patient from a melanoma physicians to a cell therapy physician. So I think it's an ongoing discussion that a lot of hospitals are having, but I think pretty much identical to Linda's organization is what my organization is doing, keeping the patient with the melanoma provider the entire time, but changing the nursing team.
So we have it set up a little bit differently here at KU. They transition to our auto CAR T service on the inpatient side for the duration of the IL-2 administration, but have very close contact and communication with the melanoma provider. They transition back to the melanoma team upon discharge. However, they're followed by our HMCT team for the first 28 days. Just they have 2 touch points that are defined, but it's just a little bit different. You're right. The nurses and the nursing team tend to take the lion's share of the work, but in terms of the formal transition, it's at discharge from the hospital. So awesome. For you that have worked so hard on onboarding these TILS therapy, give me a time frame from when you started these meetings to when you became an authorized treatment center, just to give the audience a sense of time frame. How long does it take to onboard TIL therapy? That includes your education, your meetings, all the coordination. Would love to know. Kristin, we can start with you.
I would say it's still ongoing, so it's hard to kind of say a time. I mean, the contracting piece took a long time, and we were lucky in the fact that we started it well before FDA approval. So we had it in place pretty soon after the FDA approval, and then that's really when we started meeting weekly. It's hard to have people meet weekly with a product that's not FDA approved in preparation, but I think now that we are still working at our workflows as we anticipate our first admission in the coming month.
Linda?
So at my institute, like at Kristin's, we were working on the contracting piece far before the approval. Once the first TILS therapy was approved back in February, I think we were ready. It was the end of June that we were doing our first procurement. So it was really a good 3 to 4 months before we were actually up and running.
Yeah, I generally say to become an authorized treatment center for any of these cell therapies, if you're talking from the contracting piece to the time you actually enroll in patient, I would conservatively say 9 to 12 months even, because it just takes that long to get all of the pieces in place. And then this particular therapy has so many players that you need to involve from the get-go. And because it's new to and it was the first approved cell therapy in the solid tumor space, so it was just a whole lot of new characters that you hadn't involved in the past. So I would give it a lot of time as well. And then the last question, can you talk a little bit more about the psychosocial clearance, maybe what's being assessed? And then do you have a specific caregiver assessment?
We do not have a specific, well, we kind of loop in our caregiver assessment with the psychosocial clearance. It's a series of questions that we've identified over the years in doing stem cell transplant and IECs that, we want to make sure the patient is going to be able to withstand an admission for a couple of weeks and understands critically how important follow-up care is, and understands that they may need to be readmitted if they're having any symptoms or signs that are, could happen if they have neutropenia or certain other toxicities that may occur. So part of it is really just making sure that they have support and doing an evaluation to see in their past, have they had any traumatic experiences that necessarily wouldn't be put into their chart, but may impact, how they relate and react during an admission. So really just our social worker getting to know the patient, but also typing up what we call a formal psychosocial clearance, because some payers seem to want that for authorization.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Linda, Kristin, Kirollos. Cannot say thank you enough. This is very a wonderful start to the first of our series and the first of our series. So I hope you all save the date for our next session, which will be at the end of October on operationalizing TILs in regard to science and side effects. Thank you all for joining us today, and talk to you all soon.